Welcome to this last session of the reading group on Catherine Malabou's Destructive Plasticity. And as it's the last session, some general conclusions are likely to be drawn as to what destructive plasticity ultimately is. What I should start with is kind of a formal consideration on the readings that were assigned for this session. So there's 30, 40 pages or so that were assigned for this session, as you can easily see, or as you can easily remember, can be readily divided into two. So there's roughly a first half which deals with literature mostly, with Duras and with Thomas Mann's Buddenbrook, and then a second, a more theoretical / philosophical part. Now, what is exactly in the middle of the two, and is kind of the key point of destructive plasticity altogether, is a reference to Kant's critique of practical reason. So in other words, what we have to keep in mind from the outset is that the key thing here is causality, the status of causality, and the relationship between subjectivity as such and the time-honored issue of causality. Hence also freedom, because the passage that Malabou quotes from Kant, from Kant's critique of practical reason, is one of those in which the theme of freedom is addressed as some kind of, I mean, I'm simplifying here, of course, but some kind of structural objection to causality altogether. And we will see that this is important in its own way for Malabou too. We also know from the previous sessions that there is a basic disagreement between Malabou and Kantian perspective given to as regards the status of the transcendental. Malabou twists Kant's transcendental away from Kant and into a more epigenetic conception. But we will get that. What is to be retained from as early as now is that the key thing is causality, and hence also the key thing is freedom as the flip side or objection of causality in a traditional Kantian sense. One thing to be observed is that indeed causality is at the core of at least one of the literary examples that Malabou makes, namely the one taken from Buddenbrook. And what we have here is the again the juxtaposition between two different kind of deaths that kind of mirror also the two kinds of aging that we saw in the last session, namely one kind of gradual dying as opposed to one sudden and abrupt kind of dying, as we saw the other time in the other session, that along with the gradual way of aging, there was another more discontinuous, sudden way of aging that had to be taken into account and properly theorized. So Malabou refers to this while talking about the two deaths by the two later members of the Buddenbrook family from the eponymous novel by Thomas Mann, the business-oriented Thomas and more decadent, art-oriented Hanno. Now, Thomas dies all of a sudden of a toothache or something, so something very much sudden and unpredicted and unexpected, while Hanno goes into some kind of more gradual, decadent phase that expectedly and kind of predictably eventually leads to his death. And so, yeah, once again, here we have some kind of interconnection between continuity and discontinuity. It's a kind of continuous conception of time as opposed to a discontinuous one and the other being ultimately inseparable. What is really inseparable for Malabou is two different kinds of deaths, that she distinguishes. So not only this sudden versus gradual kinds of death, but also, and perhaps more importantly, a biological death to be distinguished from a logical one. This is the exact terms that she employs in this part of the readings. And this, in fact, reconnects with what we have seen already as early as session 1, when we overviewed what Malabou called the plasticity of Hegel's system. And in her analysis of Hegel, she distinguished two kinds of time, one more chronological and the other logical, or to put it differently, one teleological and the other representational. So this kind of two different kinds of times are mirrored in these two distinguished and still inseparable forms of kinds of time, which are the kinds of death, which are the biological death and the logical death. So in other words, death as some kind of biologically frameable phenomenon, and death as form, or more specifically, the form of death qua form. And the latter being, or more precisely, the very distinction between the two being what ultimately destructive plasticity is about. And we see this as well in Marguerite Duras's own biography, especially when Duras admits to have grown old all of a sudden at the age of 18. This is, according to Malabou, a fairly striking example of what destructive plasticity ultimately is, namely this sudden, abrupt, unannounced intervention and eruption of death in the guise of its form. So the form of death which anticipates death. Again, in the same way that we have seen the two kinds of aging in the last session a couple of weeks ago. Now, Duras, of course, is perhaps the quintessential or one of the quintessential writers on trauma or after trauma. So it's one of those writers that are most usually associated with traumatic status or a post-traumatic status. Now, what interests Malabou especially is the fact that in Duras, trauma is kind of historically universalized in the sense that because of historical circumstances, trauma has become universal. But because of that, there is also some kind of distance vis-a-vis trauma, in the sense that trauma has universalized itself so much that we can now look at it with some kind of distance. This is ultimately what the kind of writing that is Marguerite Duras's manifests. The key formal example of this kind of writing, according to Malabou, is the asyndeton, namely the lack of connection between the various parts that the writing is made for, including the more straightforwardly causal connection between the parts of the writings. And with time, this has become kind of a commonplace of the kind of writing associated with trauma. So the kind of associated with trauma is one in which the connections are missing. You find that, for instance, again, for the film people here a lot in the second tome of Deleuze's diptych on cinema, but in many other places, and especially in literary studies too. So because of that, because it's a writing that is born from trauma, the connections tend to be missing, and we have this kind of fragmentary writing in which, however, the fragments that come out of trauma are, let's say, all very polished, so to speak, in the sense that they're not the kind of, they're not post-traumatic in the sense that they are rough, they're nothing wild in that kind of writing. In other words, it's a kind of succession of fragments in which each fragment stands alone in its own terms, or tends to stand alone formally in its own terms. And so because we have this kind of tendential lack of connections, we have repetition that comes in its lieu. And so as opposed to organic connections between parts, we have standalone parts, standalone fragments that are repeated over and over, or we have parts of the sentence like nouns or verbs that tends to gain autonomy, formal autonomy, as opposed to the rest of the proposition, to the rest of the sentence, to the rest of the paragraph, particularly lots of times, quite often placed toward the end of the sentence. And so through this autonomization of single words, of clusters of words within a wider fabric of writing, we have again that kind of fragmentariness as opposed to a unitary, consistent, organic flow of writing. And all of this has been associated quite customarily with the with a post-traumatic writing of sort. In her own biography, according to Malabou, Duras, not only through her writing, Duras tends to uh, embody destructive plasticity as the form of death gaining some kind of autonomy from death itself and gaining some kind of distinction from death itself. The other example that she makes, a rather significant one, is the scar on Duras's face, the early appearance of that scar on her face, as a sign of a very deep alcoholism, which will mark Duras's life deeply before the fact, in the sense that it is a symptom of that alcoholism that appeared on her body, on her face, before she even started to drink. And so, once again, drinking being one of the most customary and traditional manifestations of something that we have seen quite often in the past few sessions, namely death drive, the kind of compulsion to repeat which Freud had discovered and which is kind of related in some important way, although this thing is distinct with and from destructive plasticity. So that this important instance of the death drive, which is alcoholism, has appeared in the guise of its own form on Duras's body even before she started to drink. This again being another example of the form of death being distinct from death itself, which ultimately destructive plasticity. And indeed, the point the point of destructive plasticity and one of the conclusions that we will draw in this session is indeed not only between death and its own form, but more generally between a certain causal fabric, a certain causal texture, and a minimal difference, which, according to, among others, Malabou, is subjectivity itself, coincides with subjectivity itself. So, in other words, by distinguishing to death, the real point of Malabou is distinguishing between two kinds of subjectivity. One that is that consists fully in and lies in a causal fabric, a fabric of causes and effects, and another subjectivity, which in fact is subjectivity, according to Malabou, which is a kind of minimal difference between this fabric and itself. Or, in other words, what subjectivity really is about is is not the causes and effects that constitute a subject, but rather the subject's difference between itself and this causal fabric. And this minimal difference, in fact, according to Malabou, typically takes the shape of indifference. And it is this which makes the new wounded, which, as we've seen in the past few sessions, are those people that are affected by brain lesions and those kinds of trauma, due to which they become another person altogether, fully detached with the self, detached from the self that they used to be, or the self more generally. So that kind of indifference vis-a-vis oneself ultimately is subjectivity, according to Malabou. The new wounded embody in some kind of borderline exemplification what in fact pertains and belongs to any subjectivity, namely consisting not in a causal in a bundle of causes and effects whose result is the subject, but rather in the minimal difference vis-a-vis that bundle. Or, which is just another way to say the same thing, subjectivity consists in the indifference vis-a-vis that bundle of causes and effects, which subjectivity. So yeah, ultimately destructive plasticity is a model for subjectivity. The new wounded, those kind of people affected by brain lesion and so on and so forth, also come as a kind of borderline example of this. But this is, according to Malabou, what informs every subjectivity as such. While I was reviewing these readings, something which is probably somewhat unrelated, but not entirely related, comes to my mind. And there's this tennis player, Martina Navratilova, who flee to the US from the Czech Republic during the Cold War. And at some point she released that statement according to which in the Czech Republic there is no freedom, no, in the Soviet bloc there is no freedom of the press, while in the United States there is no freedom from the press. Now, the relation between this pun and what we are trying to get to here about destructive plasticity is that ultimately the freedom of the subject, ultimately what destructive plasticity is about is the freedom of the subject being the freedom from the subject, essentially. Or in other words, the detachment, the difference, the indifference vis-a-vis the bundle of causes and effects that a subject ultimately is. And to go a further step in the same direction, I should like to quote one paragraph in your toward the end of the readings for this session, namely, quote, go find in the great chest of metamorphosis something to dress and embody this ego that emerges from unthinkable nothingness, this enigma of a second birth that is not rebirth, end quote. So in other words, the point would be that, again, the various masks that the ego can take are contingent, are essentially contingent. What is essential instead is not the content of the various egos, but its pure form. And the pure form is the kind of nothingness that separates the self meant as ego mask in this way and the self as self. So what is essential in subjectivity is that pure difference, as opposed to the various contingent contents that that subjectivity can take. Once again, it is in relation to Freud that Malabou elaborates her argument, and the target in the readings that you have reading for the session is specifically the concept of denegation. So something like, again, simply put, something like affirming something by way of denying it. So again, the simple but quite effective example that Malabou makes would be something like a patient in therapy going in a long spiel, perhaps by recounting a dream or something, and ending his speech with something like, "But in fact, I'm not talking about my mother." And so from this, the psychoanalyst would typically understand that he is in fact talking about his or her mother. So it's that kind of affirmation through negation that is more or less related to destructive plasticity, but once again, not quite coincident with destructive plasticity. Among the things that separate the two is in destructive plasticity, the absence of repression, essentially. So denegation is about repression, whereas in destructive plasticity, whose quintessential form, as we've seen, is the kind of trauma after which a subject becomes another subject altogether. In that sense, there is no repression at all. The trauma is endorsed, embraced, and assumed quite fully without remainders. And so yeah, this is already a first difference. The second difference would be something like negotiation between inside and outside, which again, one of the key stakes of denegation, namely some kind of a rewriting, redefinition of the borders between inside and outside, is what is at stake through denegation, some kind of delimiting where the I ends and the external world begins, circumscribing what doesn't belong to the subject in order to then redefine what does belong to the subject. Now, inside and outside is precisely the distinction that is no longer there in the case of destructive plasticity, where even the interiority of the subject is regarded as something external by the subject itself. So in lieu of the kind of negotiation between inside and outside that belongs to Freud's denegation, we have something like a full-fledged externalization of the internal, again, without remainders. And more crucially, what we don't have in destructive plasticity is the kind of implicit messianic telos, implicit messianic tendency towards saving, which is there in the negation. What is denied in the negation is that which should be saved eventually through therapy the moment that the subject manages to rewrite its own history, namely the moment in which some kind of alternative causality is restored by the subject on the subject itself. So it is true that in both the destructive plasticity and in the denegation case, we have some kind of refusal of causality. We have a striving towards something that is not causality, but Malabou opposes the nothing possibility, literally, that would define destructive plasticity from the other possibility that would define denegation and therapy more generally. So, in other words, it's not a matter of finding an alternative fabric of causes and effects through which the subject rewrites its own history beyond the traumatic event, overcoming the traumatic event that triggered his need for repression, but rather what destructive plasticity would be about would be something like an immediate and indeterminate opening that is disclosed the very moment that our subjectivity slips into another, and into another that has nothing to do any longer with the previous one. Or in other words, would be something like not some kind of potential that is first unfulfilled, that is recognized as unfulfilled directly or indirectly through the negation, that is to be prospectively actualized, but rather would be some kind of indeterminate potential that is immediately actualized as potential. That it would be something like something like the immediate coincidence between potentiality and actuality. Or, as Malabou says, again, in order to mark some kind of distinction between her perspective and Lacan's, it would be something like the negative without a lack. So destructive plasticity would be the eruption of something like a negativity which changes the subject altogether, without any lack attached to the new subjectivity, in the sense that there is, particularly in relation to the previous subjectivity, from which there is nothing to save, quite literally, or nothing to restore. The new subject is one that, on the one hand, is nothing, but on the other hand, by the same token, lacks nothing as well. Or to put it in some kind of similar psychoanalytic terms, one might say that it would be something like hysteria without eros, some kind of non-eroticized hysteria, or possibly something like psychosis without God, or psychosis without a thing, or without without a big other to coincide with. Again, in the Lacanian terms that Lacan wants to mark a distinction between herself and. And yeah, more generally, it's not just about Lacan. It's a matter of, for Malabou, it's a matter of distinguishing her perspective from a rather rich tradition, particularly in French thought, that we might refer to as the entre deux morts, between two deaths, namely the kind of gap between biological death and one might say symbolic death, which shapes subjectivity. And what Malabou claims is that implicit in this conception of between two deaths that informs, again, thoughts of parts of the thoughts of people like Deleuze and Lacan and Blanchot, Bataille, and so on and so forth, would be something like, again, some kind of implicit messianic vocation to restore what had been denied, some kind of prospective horizon through which to what had to be denied through this big discontinuity that is like trauma or death and so on and so forth would eventually find some kind of second chance to a status that is needed that is somewhere halfway between life and death, neither life nor death. Again, it's this implicit messianism that is negated by Malabou in her marking her the distinction between destructive plasticity and this between two deaths, entre deux morts, that characterizes these thinkers that I just named. Last thing, before wrapping up, as I have mentioned Lacan, probably there is one thing, and in fact it has been written here and there, that in fact there is at least one place in Lacan which resembles a lot destructive plasticity as a model for subjectivity in this way, namely as minimal pure difference between the self as stemming from a causal fabric and itself, and that is the symptom. So not symptom as in symptom, but rather a word that sounds more or less the same, namely sinthome, and that would be that would correspond in Lacan to the bit of real, as you know, in Lacan is something that escapes the symbolic, that escapes the linguistic fabric, but which kind of sustained this fabric, the network of the symbolic. And so this kind of exception, so the symptom would be about naming, giving a name to this thing which cannot have a name, namely this thing that escapes the symbolic, that escape language, but which sustains the network of signification all the same. And those who have claimed this kind of similarity are correct in the sense that indeed there is a convergence between destructive plasticity intended as this model for subjectivity, this kind of identification with the nothingness of the real, which stands alongside the linguistic, the symbolic network, the network of causes and effects that the subject consists of. So this analogy is correct, but what needs to be added is that Malabou is, again, for reasons that we have clarified also in the past few sessions, namely a different conception of the transcendental framework for subjectivity. She's less interested in offering models for subjectivity than in finding instances of these models already actualized, even before being defined, in what in the previous sessions we have identified as a void intersection, an empty intersection between the biological and the cultural. And the new wounded, so those people having undergone this kind of trauma, are precisely that. They embody to the extreme that model of subjectivity, as opposed to simply illustrating that. So in other words, Lacan had named its own symptom explicitly in the name of Joyce, which again, it's James Joyce, which is kind of telling of the essentially linguistic model of subjectivity that, or at least language-based model of subjectivity that Lacan was interested in making. The kind of model that Malabou is interested in giving is one that has less to do with language than with the contradiction between biology and biology itself. So as we have seen in the past few sessions, the key thing for Malabou is that the biology and neurobiology is not some kind of natural basis from which everything else ensues, but it's like something that is in contradiction with itself, and it's within this contradiction between the biological and itself that the cultural finds its place. So this is let's say, the dimension that interests Malabou more, as opposed to one accounting for subjectivity more based in language, as in the case of Lacan. Right. So before we get to the Q&A for today, I have asked Vasco, one of my colleagues here in Lisbon, Vasco Baptista Marques, whom I thank already, um, to offer some remarks on one film by a filmmaker that he has studied extensively and who has rather explicitly come in the wake of a certain formal tradition inaugurated by Duras, among others. That filmmaker being Ritti Pan. Um, so I have asked him to comment on a film which relates quite directly with plasticity, namely Irradier. And so I would ask Vasco to please take the floor. Thank you, Vasco.
Thank you, Marco. You're very kind. I'm not at all a specialist on Ritipan, although he's a filmmaker that I've been following since the beginning. But as Marco just told you, he asked me to say some brief words about one of Ritipan's films, namely Radier from 2020. And the idea, I think, is to try to find a filmic entry point or to find a filmic connection from Ritipan with the concept of destructive plasticity, namely in what concerns the possible declination, the possible historical and political declination, or the intersection between the historical and the biological of destructive plasticity. So for those of you who might not know Ritipan, I will just say some brief words in a kind of Wikipedia manner. Ritipan is a Cambodian filmmaker who began to film on the late 1980s. His first film dates from 1989, and it's called Side 2. He's mostly a documentary filmmaker, although he has made also some fictions. And his main subject of study is undoubtedly the genocide perpetrated in Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge regime between 1975 and 1979. A massacre whose historical and political memory Ritipan somehow seeks to recover through archive footage, interviews with victims or perpetrators of the regime, and also fictional reenactments. There is a biographical reason for this focus of Ritipan cinema, namely the fact that large part of the filmmaker's family, including his parents and his sisters, died of starvation and exhaustion in a labor camp in rural Cambodia, where the filmmaker himself was forced to work from the age of 11, if I'm not mistaken. This being said, and starting to talk about the film properly, as you may guess, the title of the film, Irradier, is a reference to the radioactive effects resulting from the atomic bomb that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and by extension to historical and political traumas in general. I would say that the aim of the film, especially if we consider the previous works of Ritipan, is to somehow broaden the geographical and chronological scope of his work, of his reflection on genocide, by producing what we might call a long elegy about the various historical and political catastrophes of the 20th century. In the film, Ritipan will do this mainly through a montage of archive footage and film excerpts that evoke different situations of war or genocide: the Second World War, the Vietnam War, the Cambodian genocide, and also through the voiceover invocation of various literary and poetic sources. I would say that's the central question of the film is in fact, quite similar, as you will see, I think, to the one that Malabou formulates in the Ontology of the Accident. And that question for me would be, how can a subject survive destruction, whether neurological or political, and what remains of that subject afterwards? To show you that this is the case, I would, if Marco allows me to share the screen,
Yes,
I will
this
show
is
you a brief clip from the film.
Le mal nous cherche, si nous ne l'avons pas dispersé hors de nous, en ouvrant une paume légère. Au point le plus haut du ciel, il y a la douleur. C'est une surprise, toujours, la douleur. Au point le plus haut, ce n'est pas le soleil qui nous attend. Ou nos rêves d'autrefois, ni même la science. C'est une idée, une invention absolue de l'homme, menace l'homme dans son histoire, dans son idée. Un avion qui porte la bombe. Ce zénith efface tout, jusqu'au mal qui n'aura pas le temps de croître. Vivre est sans préparation. Mourir? Je ne sais pas. Je ne sais plus. Le monde entier a les yeux ouverts et ne trouve rien de plus puissant et beau et terrible et nécessaire que cette mort déployée.
Si tu veux vivre près.
I will return to the beginning. And what we have in the first shot, which is divided into 3 frames, is a kind of statement of identity. The 3 frames reproduce the same image, and that images in that image, as we'll later see, is that of the materials which will be used by an anonymous man to build a miniature replica of a house. The third shot of the film is also divided into 3 frames that extend the same image, and is that of the hand in close-up of the man who is beginning to build the aforementioned house, proceeding for this purpose to cut and glue the construction materials which stand out for their extreme fragility. As you can see, the house is going to be built. The building blocks of the house are mainly pieces of cardboard and small fragments of wood. The 5th shot of the film is quite significant, in my opinion, because we have once again the division into 3 frames, but this is somehow a way of the film to suggest that the identity it began by presenting us is somehow threatened by the possibility of an accident. Quite literally, the image of identity is the object of a siege by two other images that are being reproduced in the margins of the shot. And those images are those of are aerial images of a city that, as we will soon realize, was filmed from one of the B-29s that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This fifth shot is also the moment when the voiceover narration begins, which from this point onward will comment on a poetic register on the images that the film brings together. And the voiceover narration begins by saying, and I will quote, "At the top of the sky is pain. It always comes as a surprise, pain does. A pure invention of man threatens mankind in its history, in its idea. An aircraft carrying the bomb." So, in a way, this voiceover narration clearly starts by referring to a scientific invention, the atomic bomb, whose destructive potential threatens the survival of humanity. And so what we have here in this shot, and this is the main idea that will recur throughout the film, is an opposition between the image of a constructive process, namely the building of the replica of the house, and a destructive process, the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, from the point of view of Malabou's philosophy, and I know I'm being quite superficial, but this will have to do because I'm not like Marco, a specialist on Malabou, is that the identity somehow symbolized by the house and later by the photography that will be placed inside it. The idea is that identity is something always that is at risk of being either biologically or politically obliterated. If we have time, I would like to show you a second very brief clip of the film, which, in my opinion, also dialogues with Malabou's destructive plasticity. So I will show it to you.
Tokyo, Coventry, Dresde, Le Havre, Hanoï, Verdun, les collines du Rwanda, Sarajevo, Birkenau, Nankin, les noms de la Colima, tant de noms, de sigles, de codes, de terres, de villes, d'atolls, tant de lieux sans nom, tant de lieux irradiés. Toute force doit s'exercer. Ce n'est pas un théorème physique, c'est l'histoire humaine. Toute force doit s'exercer aux yeux du monde. Sinon, est-ce une arme? Est-ce une invention? Ou une faiblesse cerclée de métal? L'empereur cherche la torche qu'il jette sur sa propre ville. Puis ce fut ailleurs. Et les mêmes champs de croix blanches, si belles les soirs d'été, qu'on oublierait pourquoi.
So thank you for your patience. I showed you this last sequence of the film because, in my opinion, it introduces the true subject of the film's, so to speak, narrative, not in a classical sense, but of the film's montage. And the true subject of the film are these kind of spectral figures that we see in the end of this sequence, kind of walking behind the frosted glass in such a way that it's difficult for us to perceive their outlines. And then for me, thinking about Malabou's concept of destructive plasticity, these figures operate or function as a kind of condensations of a new wounded. They are the survivors, those who have somehow managed to escape a political and historical catastrophe. I would also have something to say about, but Marco fortunately has already brought that up, the kind of asynthetic construction of the film's visual discourse, because like in the literature of Marguerite Duras, that Ritipan has adapted in one of his films, namely, I think the English title was The Seawall, from 2008, which is an adaptation of a book by Marguerite Duras. Like the literature of Marguerite Duras, what we have here is a kind of asynthetic construction where the images kind of collide against one another, following a principle of connection that is not synthetic, neither causal, neither ruled by space or time connections, but it's a purely thematic connection. The objective is to create a kind of collision of accidents in order to better express, in my opinion, the succession of accidents or catastrophes that have marked the 20th century. And so with this, I would finish, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Vasco. I guess since it's the last session, we can go a little overboard with the timing. So even a little before 6 p.m. So I will open now the time for questions.
I just wanted to make a remark as well on the figure speech of Singleton, because I think it's for us working with cinema and also like clinically with psychoanalysis, or it is a little bit the idea of the lacks in speech somehow, or the lacks in a narrative, but in a way that is not the Lacanian lack as the Das Ding lack. So I think the senator is a very interesting tool, or like operative tool for us to work in the discourse. But that's more remark. My question for you, Marco, and for us to debate maybe is the notion of the symptom, because since the first meeting, we kind of talked a little bit about this, but in a way, after all the meetings, I think especially today when you remarked on the symptom, instead of operating with language as the structure of the unconscious, as Lacan did, and I think that what Malabou is doing is she's working with the master's discourse of science and biology as this symbolic binding of the symptom. And this is very problematic, I think, so, because it goes to the most built, and also if we go like with a critic, like if we go to with the criticism of Foucault on biopolitics and everything, how can we in a way like confront the biopolitics of science and biology being the what is binding all the three categories of the unconscious together? So how can we think about that?
But I think in the case of Malabou is more of postulating some kind of interchangeability of the possible master discourses, in the sense that of all of the books that she made, science is at the center of a few of them, but not all of them. And also the convergence itself between the discourse of science and the discourse of corporate management, for instance, the way that you can find it in What Should We Do with Our Brain, attests to not so much of, so it does not attest to some kind of preeminence of science which would explain the discourse of, for instance, corporate management. But what it would attest to would be the interchangeability between the discourses. In other words, what is essential is not so much the master discourses that are being chosen, but rather the kind of a position of difference or detachment that the subject assumes vis-a-vis them. So the kind of difference that the subject inhabits within these master discourses is the what is essential for her, no matter what are the discourses that are elevated into being the master discourses, so to speak. So yeah, I agree, but then again, I would not necessarily I would not necessarily assume that for her science is the ultimate master discourse that can explain it all. So for instance, even in the first book, science was hardly there. Like when like the master discourse there was Hegel in the first book, as in the future of Hegel. Then whatever she would have adopted eventually will always follow the same track, namely the accent would be not so much in those discourses, but in the difference being produced within them.
I'm a physician in rehabilitation, and I'm reading Malabou since her first book. I found your course by rereading the ontology of the accident. And I think that the most important thing she does is that she asks us to look at the form, to think of the form and use it. She cannot use it, though she did some collaboration with neuroscience. She cannot, from her discipline, do that. So she's talking more about psychoanalysis and the symptoms and the self and the subjectivity. But I think her problem, she says in 2023 that although she first mentioned destructive plasticity at 2007, there's no progress in neuroscience or any other discipline. We refuse to accept that. I know that from my discipline and from the others, and there are a lot of reasons. But form, I looked by after what she says. Form means structure, means shape, and function. So she talks about the symptoms, how the patients feel, or how do we feel by looking at the wounded and living with the wounded people. But nobody talks about the form. Nobody represents the form. Either in art, I was trying to find the pictures of people with back pain, of her body, and what the changes in posture are, so to make a lecture. There's nothing. Nothing. We refuse to look at it, to see the form, the posture, anything. You are in another discipline, and then we don't see it. It's in front of our eyes, and we don't see it. So we can't articulate it, we can't talk it, we can't see the patient, and we see the indifference. Indifference means an excuse, an explanation we give. It's not, Malabou says it clearly, it's not indifference in the end. So I think the problem is there, and she is very important for that. I hope some progress will be done. I'm doing work on that. I'm working with patients, and I'm doing a very good, some things that I will publish soon. So that's why you gave me some triggers and to look at it deeper and think deeper in this thing. And the other thing, if I have some time, is that she asks, she mentions the absence of or you have a stroke, you don't know of the event, you don't know anything about the event. We don't care. We have a pain suddenly. We go to the doctor. We don't know what it is. And we don't know the process. We are talking about processes now, not about causes. So it's not important to find the cause, to find the cause, to find that, but to understand what has changed. So the form will show you what has changed, and then can you do something with that or not? You might be able to do something. You might have some chances, but maybe not. That's the whole point for me.
Thank you very much, Andromachi, because this is really an excellent way to close the session. This truly encapsulates it all.
For me, Malabou is very important. She changed my view. I'm working on that on 15 years. I could not articulate, you have a stroke. I can move, make the patient move again the hand. Somewhere in the process, implicitly, he does something, deviates, doesn't see what he did, doesn't feel his hand, he can't move on. I can change it, but I could not say what I was seeing, what I was doing. It's quite difficult because we have not learned to look at the form. That's why I'm saying that.
No, this is perfect. Again, this is a perfect definition of the stakes of destructive plasticity. The only thing that I would add to what you're saying, which is again absolutely correct, is I would connect even more the two halves of or the two parts of your claim, in the sense that yes, indeed, what Malabou is ultimately claiming is that the perspective that should be adopted is the perspective of form on this. But again, the very difficulty, like the reason why it is difficult to do so is precisely that, by definition, form changes. In other words, the difficulty to adopt the perspective of form is that there's always a process involved, and which is the second part of what you were saying. So and the process is something that is not readily accessible for us. So again, the difficulty that you have, the twofold difficulty that you have pointed out, and the kind of horizon that we have to look toward, is indeed the one that the twofold one that you are saying. The only thing I would add is that we should see these two halves as the two flip sides of the same coin, as in the difficulty of approaching form and the difficulty to approach process are the same thing. This is, I think.
If I may add something there, first in medicine, first you look, you find the signs, and then you do the explanation. Then you find the process. You give an explanation there, a scientific one or not. You think that it's a catastrophic reaction, the paralysis, and then after stroke, and you can do nothing. That's an explanation, and you try to find in the neural processing. Another problem with neuroscience is that neuroscientists know the neural system. They don't know movement. They don't know other things. So we have many disciplinaries, and there is not an interdisciplinarity so good that it could progress. But I think that it's time to go. We will see soon some things, I hope. The process comes after. You first look at the facts and then think deeply, think again, make wrong decisions, give some explanations, and then come to the right answer, or the most right answer for the time. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Thank you very much.
Perfect encapsulation what I was trying to convey for the past few sessions. So thank you very, very much.
I would like, if it's possible, for you to elaborate a little bit about this this passage where Malabou says that the scar on the face of Marguerite is something like a premonition or something like something that comes before her alcoholism. I mean, I don't understand what is her point there. I mean, it's
same one as when Malabou says that, like, recalls how Duras had declared that she had officially aged at the age of 18, or the same point that I was elaborating upon in the last session regarding the two modalities of aging, as in a gradual one as opposed to an abrupt one. And
okay.
In this case specifically, as it was in the case of the sudden aging of Marguerite Duras at the age of 18, the form of aging, or the form of, well, in the case of the scar, it's not quite death, but rather the death drive in one of its most typical forms, which is overdrinking, alcoholism. So the form of that coming before, and hence coming in a form that is distinct from the actual thing, as it were. So the form of death anticipating death, as it were, or death coming as its own form, as opposed to coming in the form of actual deaths. So in other words, it's the second kind of death that she or trauma that Malabou distinguishes, like, as she distinguished the two temporalities, the chronological temporality and the logical temporality. Here, there's a biological kind of death and a logical kind of death, as in one that comes in the form of form, as opposed to coming in the form of actual death, or the real thing. And even in the future of Hegel, where she elaborates first this double temporality of chronological and logical, the temporality that articulates these two temporalities are what she calls the voir venir, so to see something coming, as in the gap between the logical time and the chronological time coming across as an anticipation through representation of what will eventually take place in a different way in actuality. So yeah, this is ultimately what both the scar and the anticipated aging of Duras are about.
Well, I think this thought that came to me is totally irrelevant with what we are talking about. It gave me an impulse, how to say. There was I think something that I would have to think better. But you know the case of Yannis Xenakis, the avant-garde composer.
Yes.
He always he had a scar on the left side of his face. This scar was due to a grenade that he took part in the manifestations of the Communist Party at the end of the war, and I think he was injured by a British grenade. And the funny thing is that he kept this all his life. I mean, he never had it operated or fixed, or a plastic surgery. And
no,
I think that's
it's very relevant, in fact.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure how, but I am sure that it's relevant. Yeah.
No, it sure is relevant, because again, it perfectly caters into the main premise of Malabou, which is what I call the empty intersection between the biological and the cultural, in the sense that that scar was not only a physical scar, but also political scar through and through. And so him having kept this scar on him is tantamount to, I mean, whether deliberately or not, it can easily come across as a political statement. Whether his intentions were those or not, it's another thing. But still, it's the presence of anything else there. Yes,
I think it's a political statement, but I think it's also a kind of very precious sign of his identity, of what he was, that he was clinging on. I mean, yeah. Well, it's food for thought. I'm not sure.
Yeah. No. So here, perhaps the closeness with destructive plasticity would be there insofar as this scar had produced something else out of him. So
Yeah.
let's say so in this regard, yes. So insofar as the scar was the direct production of a new subjectivity, then we are in presence of destructive plasticity, especially insofar as that scar is located at the intersection between these two dimensions, namely not just the physical, not just the biological, but inseparably the political one. So yes, definitely, this is indeed one of the possible example of what we had been getting at. So thank you, Panos.
So I just want to thank you for your excellent.
Thank you all for coming and for taking part to the 6 sessions, which, by the way, will be online at some point. And have a good evening.